Uh, Welcome, Jeff Klein, for the Political Military Report, February 26th.
You know, as you all know, I follow the news as best I can pretty intensely, but so much has been happening this week that it's kind of dizzying, and it's hard to know whether I'm leaving anything out. So I expect if I do, that people will speak up, and it's just becomes really hard to keep track of everything. I mean, the big news earlier in the week and still today in the mass media is the release of the bodies of the Bibas family, two children and their mother, and the whole run up to that, and the way it was publicized and used as propaganda fodder is a kind of textbook lesson in the way Israeli propaganda works and how it's amplified in our own media. Some of you may know, first of all, there was in the days leading up to the release of the bodies, there was all this speculation in the Israeli press and then the US press as to whether they were alive or not, even though Hamas had announced in November of last year that they were all killed in an Israeli bombing attack. And so the Israelis knew that was true. And even earlier on, their father was interviewed and confirmed that and condemned the Israeli government for its continued bombing in Gaza that endangered and indeed has killed many, many of the prisoners held in Gaza. And the second thing is that everybody who cares to know understands that that family was being held not by Hamas, but by another armed group that Hamas did not have direct control over. So, you followed, and as usual, the way the media goes, if you assume that Israel is lying about a media framing that aids its propaganda, you will rarely go wrong, and that's certainly the case here. Despite the fact that they were reported dead months ago, somehow a month and a half later, Israel claimed without any supporting evidence that they weren't killed by Israeli bombs, but were murdered by the people that held them prisoner. And that was repeated and amplified in the press. And I remember seeing the New York Times and the Washington Post the day after, and you had to read very, very, very far down in their articles to read the sort of offhand report that, Hamas had claimed that they were killed a year and a half ago, rather than recently. And of course, how you could determine that they were murdered by their captors by hand, so it was all very, graphic. A year and a half after they were dead, of course, no one asked that question. Of course, it seems unlikely that that's possible, and certainly it was a lie that serves the interest of Israeli propaganda. And that's the pattern we see: the spreading of some bloodthirsty, blood-curdling propaganda, which then gets debunked, but keeps being repeated in the service of labeling Israel's Palestinian opponents as savages, inhuman, and so on. And there's a dozen or so examples of that over the course of time since this attack on Gaza started. So another illustration of this was that I can't remember what day, but last week Israel reported that 3 empty buses were blown up by Palestinian terrorists. And of course, that story has disappeared entirely because 2 Jewish Israelis were arrested on account of it. And then, of course, nothing was spoken of that further. Again, this was very, very likely a false flag attack meant to inflame public opinion against the Palestinians, which kind of backfired because the perpetrators were Jewish Israelis, not Palestinians, and so it has disappeared from the media entirely since then. So, getting back to the issue of the ceasefires, of course, that's the in terms of life and death in Gaza, that's the big story. And in case you're wondering, I mean, it's a little difficult to follow, but Israel and now the Trump administration is sort of floating the idea of somehow extending phase one, that is, which would result in the release of more prisoners from Gaza, but without Israel carrying out its obligations under phase two of the agreement. Phase two of the agreement means Israel has to withdraw its troops from all of Gaza and agree to a long-term, if not peace, at least a long-term ceasefire. And Israel, of course, doesn't want that. It wants more prisoners to be released, but it doesn't want to commit to stopping its assault on Gaza. And that's sort of where we are now. And the Trump administration and their envoy, Witkoff, seems to be bending a little bit more in the direction of the Israeli narrative there. And meanwhile, even though the bombs are, for now, not falling in Gaza, people continue to die in Gaza. There are numerous Israeli attacks that violate the terms of the ceasefire. And of course, the conditions in Gaza, the living conditions, are horrific and now amplified by the fact that it's winter time. And although their winter is not like our winter, cold in the coast of Palestine is like the relatively warm days we've had in the past few days. It gets into the 40s. But if you imagine living outdoors in a tent with no heat, a temperature of 40 or 45 can be deadly. And of course, Palestinian infants and children have been dying every day of the cold. And again, this doesn't get reported very much, and especially when compared with all the publicity about the death of, the Israeli children that were captured. Many more times than that die every day in Gaza, and of course, tens of thousands over the course of this Israeli attack. So there's this disproportionate focus on Israeli victimhood and kind of covering up or ignoring Palestinian victimhood, which has been the pattern of this whole violence. Whether the ceasefire will be negotiated to proceed to the next phase or not is uncertain, and it depends on what the Trump administration will do and the dynamics of internal Israeli politics. Most Israelis don't like Netanyahu and want the release of more prisoners, but they also want further violence against Palestinians and continuing of what we know as genocide. So we don't know what's going to happen. And meanwhile, in the West Bank and in Syria and Lebanon, Israel is demonstrating that it is not only genocidal with respect to Gaza, but effectively an outlaw nation in terms of international law and international relations. So the West Bank, it has continued and escalated its destruction of cities in the northern part of the West Bank, particularly Tulkarem and Jenin. It has flattened much of the refugee camps, which are neighborhoods in those cities, not camps in the sense that we see in Gaza. It has flattened them and expelled 40,000 inhabitants from those neighborhoods in Tulkarem and Jenin, and has announced that they will not let them return anytime soon. So this is, again, another version of ethnic cleansing and a kind of Gaza light, maybe not so light. Israel has been using military aircraft to bomb the West Bank, and now tanks also invading these cities. So you have mini Gazas in parts of the West Bank. And of course, the far right of the Israeli political establishment is openly, applauding the potential for further ethnic cleansing in the West Bank and potential for Israeli annexation de jure, by law. And of course, effectively, it has annexed the West Bank, but there's always the demand to do it, announce it officially and legally. And the Trump administration is, kind of waffling. They give different messages, but they're suggesting Trump has said basically whatever the Israelis do is fine with him. That's been the latest series of statements. And if you want to get a view of how what a totally bizarre moment we are living in historically. Many of you have heard about the video that Trump released showing the new Trumpified rebuilt Gaza. It's quite stunning. I mean,
No.
jaw-dropping. If you Google it, you'll find it. It was a video that shows Trump. It ends with Trump lying in a beach chair next to Netanyahu in the new rebuilt Trump Gaza. And I suggest you look for it. You can find it easily. It's been all over Twitter, and if you Google it, you'll find, and in the Israeli press, by the way, it's been reported in the Israeli press. It's truly bizarre. Among other things, it shows Trump Gaza Hotel and Resort and a golden statue of Trump erected in the middle of Gaza. I mean, it's just beyond belief. So elsewhere, Israel continues its aggression against Syria and Lebanon. Its troops have advanced further into southern Syria, have bombed in and around Damascus, and have announced that they're there to stay, and that they have warned Syria that its military forces are not allowed to be active anywhere in Syria south of Damascus. So Israel is, preparing a long-time stay, maybe annexation of further parts of Syria. We just don't know. And they do this, of course, with impunity, taking advantage of the fact that Syria is in, a chaotic transitional period, and with most of its weaponry destroyed already over many dozens of Israeli attacks. So whether they have the will or the ability to resist Israeli further annexation is not clear. In Lebanon, some of you may have seen reports of the funeral of the assassinated leader of Hezbollah, Hassan Nasrallah, in Beirut, and various news reports placed the number of people attending the funeral as 1 million or more. And I remind you, Lebanon, the total population of Lebanon is a little bit more than 4 million altogether. So a gathering of that size is a substantial, part of the Lebanese population, both Christians and Muslims. Many of them revere the former leader of Hezbollah. And Israel took advantage of this event to bomb, again, violate, as they've been doing all along, violate the ceasefire by bombing areas of Lebanon away from the border. You all know they've refused to withdraw completely from Lebanon, which they were obligated to do under the ceasefire. And they flew F-35 US-made aircraft low over the funeral crowd in Beirut as a show of strength and as a threat. So it's it's hard to keep track of all the violations of international law that Israel and its own agreements that Israel is carrying out. There also are reports that have been repeated in the last week that the U.S. assesses that Israel is getting ready to attack Iran before the end of this year, and some reports that indicate the U.S. may support that and actively participate in it. You've heard some of the Iranian nuclear facilities and military facilities are buried deep underground, and Israel itself doesn't have weapons that can threaten those. So there's talk of them borrowing the U.S. 30,000-pound bunker-busting bomb. But in order to use that, they would have to use U.S. aircraft. There's no Israeli aircraft that can carry a weapon of that size. So who knows what will happen. Meanwhile, in the U.S., some people from the Trump administration and certainly from his supporters are actively promoting Israeli annexation, legal annexation of the West Bank. There was a CPAC, a conservative political action conference, in which many, supported that idea, and other pro-Israel organizations are now trumpeting that idea that Israel should annex the West Bank, Judea, and Samaria. There's a bill in Congress to forbid calling that area the West Bank, and only it should be called Judea and Samaria. And we're going to get into the issue of the ICC later on, but I just want to point out that Netanyahu has been invited to visit Poland and Germany, both of whom are signatories to the International Criminal Court, and he's been offered immunity by them, even though that violates their own laws. Whether he'll take them up on that or not, we don't know. So I guess I'm probably leaving out some stuff. I apologize for that, but there's so much. So I'll stop now, and maybe if people have questions or stuff to add, I'll be reminded of what I left out.
Thanks, Jeff. Comments and questions? Paul?
Yeah, Jeff, on Saturday, Hamas released, I think, 6 more prisoners, and Israel refused to release the group of Palestinian prisoners that was supposed to be done in exchange of those particular 6 Israeli prisoners. Were those 600, I think, Palestinian prisoners ever released?
I think that Israel has committed now to resume releasing those prisoners. They claim they held it up. They delayed it because they charged that Hamas was violating the ceasefire terms. As far as I can tell, that's not true. What irked them, what irked the Israelis especially, was that Hamas had these big public celebrations of the release of the prisoners with a lot of propaganda and so on. Whether that was wise or not is a question, but it's, to my understanding, there's no way that violated anything that was specified in the ceasefire agreement. And of course, that was all magnified over the release of the bodies of the Bibas family. Again, you can question whether they should have done it the way they did it, but it certainly was, as I saw videos, it was not disrespectful. I mean, the children were in coffins, and it was a solemn occasion. And instead, it's the Israeli government that has violated the privacy and sanctity of that family, and has been protested. The family has protested that Israel was using the deaths of their children for political gain, and had agreed that the funerals should be private and not public. Israel has been using them as propaganda tools, which is just really unseemly, really disgusting. So the best I know, either those extra prisoners have been released or are going to be released soon, because they say that things are on track now to resume the process. So, but I can't say for sure it's happened already.
Thanks.
Thanks. Noble?
Had trouble unmuting. Yeah, Jeff, these reports are really very valuable, and it would be great if more people could hear them than just those of us who attend. I don't know how to do that, but that's just a thought.
If you look in the agenda, Cole always puts in a link to the playlist of these reports, whether they're that valuable or not. But if anyone really wants to see them, you can watch on YouTube.
Oh, really? Oh, just the report. Okay, great. I hadn't noticed that. Actually, and Cole, is there an agenda that was put? I didn't see an agenda sent out.
No, Noble, I sent it out, but I sent it out to the wrong list. So I just sent it out after we had gathered. That's why there are a smaller number of people here at 5:30 than usual. But then I sent it again, and more people have been coming in. So that was my mistake. But you do have that in your email, Noble.
Yeah. So, and as a reminder, those 4 talks I gave about the historical background to Gaza are also available on YouTube if anyone wants to watch them or recommend them. And again, I'm very happy to note that 1,600 will have watched the first one, kind of less so the following ones, but that's much better than the 25 or 30 people that I would have taught the class to if it hadn't been canceled.
Okay, next up is Dan.
Yeah. Jeff, I think I read today, possibly in the Globe or the Times, I can never keep track, that Israel had agreed to release the 600 Palestinian prisoners
I think so.
if Hamas refrained from these demonstrations, and Hamas said we're not going to do that anymore. So it
Yeah.
sounds like it's going to go through. Is that
Yeah.
right?
That's what I read also, that Hamas has agreed they're going to be lower key about transferring. Right now, the only transfers that remain in phase one are bodies, dead bodies. And of course, if anyone is following, Israel, of course, has desecrated, Palestinian dead regularly and continually. And although they haven't made a big celebration about the release of the Palestinian prisoners, they made them wear clothing that had Israeli slogans on them. And of course, many of them were severely injured and beaten. And that continues not to be reported in the same way, especially on the Bibas story. It doesn't get reported in the mainstream.
So true.
Okay, thank you. So now we're going to go on to Susan Nicholson, who has a report on the Joint Resolutions of Disapproval. But before I can call on her, Paul put his hand up again. Go ahead, Paul.
Well, I just wanted to know that if, given what's going on is so terrible, but if there is full-scale resumption of the destruction, of what's been going on in Gaza and returns to what it was, it just seems that we should be ready to do something and get as many people as possible out.
Okay, thanks. Susan.
Oh, can you remove the spotlight from Jeff?
Yeah.
Yes, I have done so.
Okay, last week, as you probably all know, we did send out an action alert urging our senators to introduce JRDs and support JRDs for this new tranche of weapons that Trump plans to deliver to Israel. Since then, you probably all know Senator Sanders has introduced JRDs.
And what's a JRD?
I'm sorry?
What is a JRD?
Oh, sorry, Joint Resolution of Disapproval. It's a way that the Congress can stop the president's intention to send weapons to Israel. The president is required to let the Congress know, and then the Congress has a certain period of time in which they can act to try to stop that. And the way to do it is by filing joint resolutions of disapproval. Joint refers to it being filed both in the Senate and in the House. The Senate filings are privileged, and so they're much easier to be brought to the floor, and that's where the action is. So since Senator Sanders has now introduced JRDs to block the transfer of these new weapons to Israel, we are planning to send out another action alert, just to inform the senators that that has happened. Now they have something to get behind and to urge them to do it. And the goal, of course, is to get at least as many senators who signed the last batch of JRDs, which was last year. I think, Cole, you can remind me what 16, 17, or 18, or 19 signed at least one of the JRDs that Senator Sanders introduced. The hope is that we'll have at least as many this time. So Jeff, Grace, Cole, and I are working on that, and we hope to have it sent out either tomorrow or the next day, probably the day after. Any questions?
Karishma.
Hi. So some of you may already know, I live in New Hampshire, and we are trying to work on Senator Shaheen. She did support the JRDs last time around. It required a lot of work on our end, but and as well, most of the credit goes to Amy Antonucci of New Hampshire Peace Action, but Senator Shaheen did end up supporting it, and we're hoping she will do it again this time. But this time we're also trying to target Senator Hassan. Chances of moving her are 0, but at least we can kind of publicly shame her, hopefully. We'll see.
Well, as Cole points out, sending out these action alerts and having people then respond, which means something gets sent into the office, is only one step. And the equally or more important step is to actually get personally to the senators to talk to them about it. So it's a joint kind of effort.
Correct. We even had a vigil in front of her office today, met with her staff, Shaheen's staff. So anyways, so you guys have great senators. We have to work on ours.
Okay, and I think Jeff has taken on to contact the senator's aides, Mandy Smith-Berger and Tom Kalina, and I have been derelict in not giving him that contact information, which I'll do right now, so that can get underway. Pat. You're muted, Pat. Are you still muted?
Am I unmuted now?
There you go. Yep, perfect.
All right. I wanted to say that UUJME legislative group is interested in sending around an action alert if someone else has written it right now. They don't. So the one that Susan writes and sends, I will send to UUJME that they will then distribute to UUs. And it reminds me that there may be others of us who can forward this action alert to people and organizations we know outside of Massachusetts, in case they aren't already making their own or doing this on their own. Thanks. Bye.
Okay, great.
Glad to hear that about UUJME, Pat.
Great. So that's coming up with the JRDs, and we have to get the Senate co-sponsors on there, and then, press for a vote. Was there anything Odelia just sent the FCNL update a few minutes ago. I haven't had a chance to look at it to see if there are any updates in there, but I guess we'll get them out if there are anything of note. Okay, next up is Grace on the UNRWA bill. Grace Cowell.
Yes. All right, so the other piece of the action alert we're going to be sending out is urging representatives to support the UNRWA Funding Restoration Act, which is actually a reintroduction of the bill. It was originally introduced in the House back in September and then also in the Senate in November. But the purpose of this bill is to restore U.S. funding for UNRWA. The U.S. originally prohibited funding back last March 2024. Their reason being that in response to allegations that there were UNRWA employees who were directly involved in the October 7th attacks, but these concerns were addressed and the employees were fired, and many other major UNRWA donors and U.S. allies had also pulled funding, but they've all since restored it. So as UNRWA serves as the primary humanitarian aid force in Gaza and the West Bank, and the U.S. has historically been one of their largest financial supporters. So it's pretty vital for the U.S. to restore their funding so UNRWA can really operate to their fullest extent and continue providing a lot of humanitarian aid there. And currently, it's supposed to be reintroduced next week by Rep. Andre Carson, but there's currently only 17 co-sponsors, 16 co-sponsors, and then Carson's the sponsor. But last session, there were 72 co-sponsors. I think there were 62 original ones. So it's pretty important that we reach out to our senators and try and get them to support it. So that's all I have. I don't know if Susan or Jeff has anything else to say. But
So I actually have a question. Is the UNRWA bill pending in the House or in the Senate?
In the House.
Okay.
Or sorry, I meant representatives, not senators to support it.
So which Massachusetts reps have already co-sponsored it?
Ooh, I'm not positive.
Okay, so as of yesterday, when we got this communication, it was Rep. Lynch was the only one who had done so.
Okay.
So the ones who usually are more quick to support Palestinian issues are Rep. Ayanna Pressley and Rep. Jim McGovern, and they had not done so as of yesterday. So they would be the low-hanging fruit. Jeff.
Yeah, so I suspect that information about who's signed on to it is sort of inside info. It hasn't been filed yet, as far as
right. They're
they're in the process.
They're looking for what they call original co-sponsors,
Yeah.
who are co-sponsors that are announced when the bill is first released with the press release and all that.
Yeah. Okay. I tried to find the bills, and there's nothing has been filed yet in the House or the Senate. So.
Right, and that's because they're looking for the original co-sponsors, so that it looks stronger when they come out of the gate.
Yeah.
Okay, and now we'll go back to Susan for the ICC lawsuit, or whatever, ICC complaint, I guess I could call it.
So the organization Democracy for the Arab World Now has recently filed a 172 submission with the ICC, asking the ICC to investigate Blinken, Biden, and Austin for aiding and abetting the war crimes and crimes against humanity that the ICC has charged Netanyahu and Gallant with. So basically, whatever the ICC has issued the arrest warrants for, now the ICC is being asked to investigate these officials in the US for complicity in those crimes. And complicity, aiding and abetting a war crime, is itself a war crime under the ICC statute. So this is a very promising development. They filed, did I say, 172-page submission. They have an excellent press release describing this, summarizing it, and they gave an hour-long press conference a couple of days ago explaining what they are doing. I think it's a great development. The particular things that they are looking to establish U.S. complicity are, number one, obviously, providing $17.9 billion of weapons at the time that this was filed. Executing 7 UN Security Council vetoes to enable the carnage to go on, and providing full-throated support, diplomatic, public relations, defense of what Israel is doing in the public media. So those 3 things would constitute the complicity in the war crimes. And get this, since there have been attempts to hold these officials accountable in US courts, we know about the Center for Constitutional Rights, we know about the Taxpayers Against Genocide lawsuit that was filed, and both of those attempts have been dismissed by the courts. The road is clear to the ICC, because it's easy to prove that the US courts are incapable of holding these officials accountable for complicity in war crimes. If the US courts were capable of doing that, then the ICC would say, oh, we can't intervene, we'll let the national courts deal with this. But since the national courts have proven they can't do it, the road is clear to the ICC. I have noticed just today that Code Pink sent around a petition or a letter to the ICC that could be signed by all of us, supporting this filing and urging the prosecutor to go ahead and start open an investigation. So I signed it. Didn't think it could hurt. I don't know how much it'll help, but that's the only thing I could think of doing it this time. I do recall that at the press conference, Dawn, Democracy for the Arab World Now, did ask for contributions to cover the expense of this case.